And one of the main reasons that the West Coast is losing and losing really bad is because the people who put the rules and regulations into play, they didn't really understand the market and how it actually operated. And some of the rules that they made emboldened people to maybe even not follow the rules because the penalty that you were going to get by following the rules were not severe enough to make you not do it. So what would happen would be if I had a dispensary and I'm right over here and I'm paying excise tax, local tax, sales tax. My eighth is $50. By the time I finish with all that tax, now it's like at 67. And then right over here is a guy who is not of the legal market. His eighth is $50. He's paying no taxes. His eighth is probably just as good as mine, and he'll give you a free brownie as you're going out the door. Where are you going to go to get your product? And that was the problem that happened. Unfortunately, in LA, we didn't get the nice start like everybody else. We were actually already going. And I've never owned cats, but I can imagine putting a cat back in the bag is not that easy for you guys who own cats. And that's what they were asking us to do. And so when you start off with about 2,700 illicit shops, and then you make the rules and say, okay, now can you guys come and follow the rules? It doesn't work so well. There was a thing called pre-ICOs for the people who know about Los Angeles situation. I was one of the original guys that opened up, probably first 2 or 3 in the city of LA. And we would go down to the mayor's office and we'd go, hey, we're gonna follow Compassionate Use Act, 1996, all of this good stuff. We've opened up, but if you guys don't put rules and regulations, there are gonna be more people opening up every day. Then I did a little movie called Super High Me that ended up on Cinemax, Showtime, and everything else. And the world got a taste that there was a place that you could go and buy legal cannabis. When that coincided with the reality of them not putting rules in place, well, what do you think happened? Everybody and their mama started to open up a shop. And it's the same thing that you saw some of that Tremaine White talked about earlier, is that you see shops open up all across New York right now, little trucks and, all of that is going on. That's exactly what happened with us. So what you all have to do in the New York market is stop that before it got to where we got to. Because if you do not, putting that cat back in the bag is not going to be very easy at all.
Thank you. I want to get into some of the details of how New York can do that later on. But before that, Dashida, you're a regulator in Portland. How does this issue impact Portland and Oregon more generally? Is there a similar issue going on, or has that state been able to avoid some of the pitfalls you're seeing in California?
Well, first of all, I think it's really hard to hear, but I apologize. I want to make sure I'm answering the question. How is it impacting Portland, Oregon, and then anything different from California? I do think a major, big difference is the regulation level. California, in many ways, is over-regulated. And when you're over-regulated, you make it very difficult for anyone, even if you are, standard business owner and you maybe have another license, to want to navigate that field. And I think Calvin addressed some of that, and Oregon does have a lot less. But I think when you enter into the space without justice, without the culture, and without the science, you're just gonna be assuming that people are gonna come just because it's weed. And in fact, there's a really strong loyalty to doing what most people have been familiar with doing for decades. I also think that there is a lot of confusion of what we're talking about. Illicit, by definition does mean like it's not regulated, it's unregulated. But the over-regulation in some ways has created an extra layer of illicit that actually does not fit into the definition of what we consider the legacy market. And the cannabis health equity movement, a movement that I have been one of the co-founders with Dr. Rachel Knox, we talk a lot about definitions and lexicon because it's changing. I'm glad we moved from black market, certainly, for obvious reasons, but illicit still sorts, in some ways it's confusing because there's a legacy market that we consider to be the supply and the demand of an unregulated market that previously existed, has a legacy. Why? Because communities depend on that revenue created. And that's one thing. And it was actually purposely left out of all of the mature legal market. So in that way, Oregon messed up as well. And it never really felt, invited to transition, only a small few. And then we have people who came into the regulated market, it was over-regulated as described in Cali, and they hired a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of really smart people to get in the room to figure out all the loopholes in that law and in that regulatory framework to operate in the gray. And that illicit market is one that is now in some ways co-opting the legacy, but they never existed before. It's newly created as a result of over-regulation. In that regard, I think Cali did it the worst. They have this really, really big gray area where, again, a lot of mostly white male businessmen got in a room, not really understanding the culture of cannabis, thought it was just weed, thought they could just sell it. It didn't work. 280E crushed them. They didn't manage P&Ls well, and as a result, they decided to look at all the loopholes and create their own gray. That, again, there's less risk in doing it wrong than it is in trying to run all the hoops of doing it right. And that's that pressure on the legal market is what's killing it, whether it's California or Oregon. So we got to break down and know what we're talking about, and I think New York does. I think Chris Alexander and the Office of Cannabis Management does, and I think when we wrote and we really lobbied and supported the MRTA, we knew what we meant when we were talking about legacy markets. So that's what I'll be talking about, how we get that into the legal market, and why we have to be intentional as regulators to do that.
Yeah, and on the topic of overregulation, I mean, Chris, Weedmaps is in a whole bunch of states and involved in policy discussions in so many states and other countries. What do you see, are there examples in other states where there is the right balance, and or what are some examples, do you think, of not overregulation? What does it mean to not overregulate the cannabis industry?
So I think, look, one thing is there's always the local control issue. So example of that, Oklahoma didn't allow cities to have a say in whether there was licensing. And you didn't end up with a blockage of the number of licenses. It worked really well from the view of eliminating illicit shops, because why would you not get a license? If you could rent a former vitamin store and you could make a sign, you could have a cannabis shop. And so it was really effective in that regard. I think there was an old hustle in Colorado. Hustle's not a bad term, but there were metric tags came about. Metrics was this track and trace system. You'd have to get a plastic barcode tag for every plant. They had a monopoly on the barcode tags, and the tags cost like $2.99 a pop. They were the bane of any grower knew what they were doing, because you go to cut the plants down, and if you cut below where the tag is sitting, it would fall off the bottom of the stem, and then you're running around, and it was a huge operational cost. $2.99 a tag was bonkers if you went to destroy a plant. And the thing is it wasn't stopping diversion, because if you wanted to divert it, just don't put a tag around the bottom and grow it in a different room. It's that simple. And I think if you look at crazy zoning stuff, the minute you give somebody on the zoning side complex enough zoning rules where you need someone who knows how to do GIS mapping software to do it, well, you just automatically run the cost for it. And so I'd say, I'll just stop here because I can go on and on and on with states and that sort of thing, but I'd say unless a state and a regulator can point and say it specifically helps this part of human health, safety, community, it specifically supports this goal of social justice or getting people, unless it's really tied to that. And that last piece, what I mean is, when Oakland moved early on social equity, the paperwork requirements were so rigorous, and only borders keep 10 years of rental records and stuff, and it wasn't properly timed. So I think it's just making sure that there's a logical congruence between regulations and what you're trying to get done. And if there's not one, then don't do it.
Earlier today, Chairwoman Wright, Tremaine Wright, said, right now we're in this period of education, and eventually in the future we'll want to move towards enforcement. I'm curious for each of your thoughts on what should that enforcement look like? Are we talking civil enforcement? Are we talking fines? Should there be law enforcement involvement? What do you think? What does that mean to you?
I'm going to jump in because I'm shaking my head. I think, again, we go back to language. And for our office in the city of Portland, where I'm the head regulator, where we do over 400 licenses in the jurisdiction, we are about facilitative government administrative work. The same way when you're trying to get a driver's license. At the end of the day, cannabis is medicinal, first and always, is inherently so. And even in the Oregon Constitution, it got changed. It should be treated like medicine. A lot of people think there are different things, different ways to think about that. But what we do know is that the harm reduction is on how tightly wound we are about the plant and access to the industry. So enforcement, especially when you think about the history of the war on drugs, is a word that is easily triggering. It's certainly in New York, the state that has arrested more people than any other state in the country for cannabis possession. So we should be looking at facilitating. The same way you're trying to get a driver's license. We're facilitating people having the credentials and the proof and basic paperwork to get into the industry. In fact, I'm gonna be real, back home, I'm from Brooklyn, I'm back home now, and I've been driving around, and we need to actually put more regulations on the driver's license and less on the businesses, to be honest. I do think that is one of the best examples of a regulatory agency that is working in partnership to facilitate, as soon as your child becomes 16 with parents, how do you become a licensed business? I think what a world it would be if we were actually doing that with 16-year-old high schoolers around the cannabis industry, especially knowing how much we need to uncover. I think we have to change the perspective. In our office, we are definitely trying to facilitate education, equity, and access for the long-term sustainability. So it's language, and so I hope New York looks for facilitating instead of enforcement.
Like I said earlier, when we ran across that, the cat was already out of the bag. So what the city decided to do, because of guys like myself saying, hey, if you don't put rules and regulations in and try to do something to bring everybody in, this is going to be too big for you to control. They didn't do that. So by the time they did it, it was about 2,700 people, like I said. So what they did was, okay, all right, check this out. Whoever comes down by September 17th at 5 o'clock and bring me your address, where your business is, something from the landlord, basic things. If you come and do that, then you'll be included in those regulations. Well, guess what? If you've ever heard this pre-ICO story, it was only 187 people to do that. I was one of the guys to do that. And my good friends who were in the industry, they were like, dude, you crazy. If you go down there, it's just like giving the DEA a file and they're gonna come get you tomorrow. See, what you guys have the luxury is of 16 years of this being out there. Initially for us, we didn't have anything to say that they weren't going to come and get us. So the biggest thing that I try to say, like I go up to Albany to Senator Sanders' office, he invites me up to be a part of helping this because he knows I've seen what has gone wrong. And what we did, we brought a whole bunch of legacy people to the office. We didn't allow cameras, we didn't allow any of that so that they would feel comfortable talking about what they felt would help them. This is in New York. And, amazingly, initially it was a little East Coast, West Coast beef with me. And I was like, no, I'm a good guy. And the guy's like, Calvin's good. And then after I got my East Coast, he's cool. Then when they realized that I was actually a legacy guy first, and when I explained to them that, hey, it took everything in me to go and turn in my information, but somebody had to do it. And later, maybe 2 months into it, they started shutting down the shops that didn't come in. And maybe a year later, the licenses that were handed out, the pre-ICO licenses, you know, they were going on the market for like $10 million not too long ago. So all of those guys who didn't go in, they lost a windfall and having a license that was very valuable. So my thought on it is, you're gonna have to do something, whether you put it in the regulations, however you do it, you gotta make the legacy guys feel that if they come into the market, there are gonna be repercussions. And you gotta make them understand by coming into the market, it's actually gonna be better for you. All of these types of things are gonna have to be displayed out from the Office of Cannabis Management and everybody else that's talking in order to get people in. And those are some of the things that I think will work.
Nick, I think and it's funny, the big thing is you have to issue enough licenses to get people to switch over. I'll give you a quick example. A couple of years ago, we were doing early work. I won't name the state, but they were going really hard on some kind of regressive stuff. Like, yeah, we'll issue some licenses, and then we're just going to come after everyone else. And so what we did was we did a survey of the whole law enforcement and jurisdictions. We worked through the math, how much it costs to do a raid on a dispensary. On the low end, it costs about $50,000 by the time you pay your officers, you bag and tag evidence, you went through the paperwork, and everything else per dispensary. What happens when a dispensary does is you reduce the amount of inventory you have on hand at any given time. You move cash off say quickly, and so anytime an officer is coming in and they're going to do a raid, they're taking less product, generally well less than $10,000 worth of product in cash, versus police departments spending $50,000 to $100,000 per enforcement action. What happens is the budget is finite, the enforcement stops very quickly. Enforcement mathematically does not work. And so for people who want to pretend it's a thing, it's just the math does not work. And so what happens is anyone who thinks like, oh, we'll legalize, we won't issue that many licenses and enforcement will clean up the rest, you have about, for a small city, about 10 raids and then they run out of police budget. And those people will reopen, one store will reopen 15 to 20 times. So at the end of the day, you issue enough licenses. That store I walked by last night on the Lower East Side, go give them a license and give them inspections and make sure they're following the rules. Anything else, it just doesn't work.
So with the licensing issue, I mean, you mentioned Oklahoma earlier, and I think there are some other, state programs we can look at. I really love Maine's medical cannabis market because it's, 75% of the sales are mom and pops, and I feel like it's a very unique program, and, it's low barriers to entry. Anybody could pay $500 and have a grow tent and, be compliant. But also then, on the other side of that, you have a situation like in Oregon where there was a huge number of licenses given out off the bat, a huge supply glut, and then plummeting prices, and then the industry kind of suffers because of the plummeting wholesale prices, and a lot of people go out of business, etc. So I'm curious for all of your thoughts on how do you balance the sort of unlimited licensing with the health of the market and helping people build sustainable businesses.
We market dynamics. I'm in the room with a lot of regulators and legislators that are dealing with the tax structure, dealing with the confinement on the weight that you can have as personal use, not really understanding impact of home grow and yields, and they're coming up with what they feel are adequate projections on where they're going to be. But no one really understands the unregulated markets, weed market dynamics. I came from Target and Victoria's Secret, and the consumer behavior, a lot of the regulatory aspects is opposite of the consumer behavior. On-site consumption, for example, the ability to gather something like the oldest thing you're probably doing when you're consuming cannabis in terms of current cultural consumer behavior is usually the last thing from a regulatory standpoint that is figured out. So essentially, we do have, in my previous world, before being a government official, I was a businesswoman. We have people who are trying to run the business of cannabis or the industry development of cannabis for these states without understanding the key performance indicators, without understanding the actual thing that's driving behavior, without working, to be honest, and this is me being selfishly here with Chris and saying, Weedmaps has so much data, and being a person of data-driven decision-making and required required doing so in big companies like Target, we should be requiring that of the government as they're rolling out these things. If the framework doesn't align with some of the insights we're getting from big company that has big data, then we should probably be building frameworks that can actually drive revenue there. I think it's about having the right minds. We also have so many people who are trying to guess about the economics, but they completely ignore billions of supply and demand in the unregulated market. How do you do that? You can't. And therefore, it's just this equation of ignoring what's right in our face. And just because you don't want to be saying, okay, I'm part of it. But back to enforcement, back to some of the things that we're doing, we need to figure out how that gets integrated. And that, to me, is how we overcome some of these challenges. And the last thing I'll say about Oregon is, I'm there and I'm shocked every day because it's a mature market. You think I'm from Brooklyn, I'm going there, and I'm like, oh my God, it's Popland, not Portland. There's a lot of canophobia. Canophobia is a word I came up with because every time I'm in front of the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission to give my update for the city of Portland, I'm challenged on legalization. And I'm like, bruh, it's already been so long that it's been legalized. I wouldn't even have a job if it wasn't legalized. I'm not here to debate legalization. I'm here to ensure that it is, again, with equity, it is with access and sustainability. So they're still really behind. And as a result, I think it only makes it even more difficult for the legal market to thrive. Not a lot of people have converted. Not a lot of people really understand the science behind it. And to me, an adult use market is completely correlated to the medical market. And so if you have places like Washington and Oregon where the medical market completely dwarfs, they're representing less than 1% of their total population that could potentially be using cannabis as medicine just based on how they go to the doctor. We have a real public education issue. And so for me, New York needs to look at what's the medical program looking like. Of course, we added flower, they cleaned up the floor, cleaned house, got some of those barriers out the way, but now it's about real mainstream public education about the benefits so that the adult use market can thrive as well.
Just drop it. Just drop it.
She's on point. She's on point. The reality of it's a lot of factors. I wish it was like this magical answer, because a lot of people come to me, Calvin, you've seen it all. Give me that magic bullet. There is no magic bullet. The reality of it is, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. And from what I see, literally the state that surrounds the state that you're in has a lot to do with that. One of the biggest reasons that Oklahoma is making so much money, because one of the biggest states in the union, Texas, is right below it, is illegal as hell. And more than half of those guys just go up across the line, get their pot, have a good time, and they come back around. And if you check every state that has states that are around them that are still illegal, they're killing it. And they're not killing it because that's a real cool state and they have the best weed. They're killing it because the states that are around them are still illegal. So until it gets even more saturated and you start to see almost every state at least have a medical program or something like that, you're gonna have these problems with oversaturation, and you're gonna still be trying to figure it out. But I would say, like what she's saying, education is just the number one thing. I think that's something that we have to push out to people so they understand why you shouldn't support the legal shops versus the illegal ones, or how the hell you want to call it these days. But it's just a big deal, and it's a lot of factors. That's what I'm seeing.
I think a couple things. One, I don't think there's another industry where it's the job of the license issuing agency to ensure the financial success of the licensees. Like, for instance, you have to be licensed to be a car mechanic in New York, and they don't categorically go around and count how many cars are in that city before they decide whether you get a car license. And so I do think that educating businesses to make them successful, but I think anytime we've seen a state try and say, well, let's cap licenses or that sort of thing to get the number right, nobody gets the number right because consumer demand is growing over a fact of time. I think a funny thing is, okay, is there anyone here who's in New Jersey or planning to operate in New Jersey? So I'm going to tell you something you probably don't want to hear. New York is about to absolutely inhale the consumer demand of New Jersey because I don't think there's going to be enough supply and their prices are going to be higher than New York's. I mean, yeah, New York is. I think the same thing is true of Western Mass, and I think all those stores in Western Mass are in for a rude awakening. We need enough licenses licenses, you need enough supply to reach market demand. And I think that's one of the things where New York has taken a prospective approach on it. I think that will help the operators here, because I think they may get Texas-type demands coming across the state. The only other thing I'd say on the whole like enforcement thing and that is like, I think there is a lot of cannabis stigma that sits behind it. So I grew up in a rural area, and people would have illegal car mechanic shops who weren't licensed by the state. But you know, if you had a backyard and you could do stuff. I think if you took that example and thought, they're gonna come in and they're gonna bust these illegal car mechanic shops, but then for giggles, they're gonna smash the windows of every car there, they're gonna slash the tires of every car there, and then they're not actually gonna arrest anyone, they're gonna leave, because that's how illegal cannabis enforcement generally goes down. People would think that was crazy. And if you then went and said, hey, we should maybe get one of those guys, there's a new shop down the street that's open, let's get them in and maybe let them run an auto shop, and the city or the state said, no, we ban anyone who did that before, I think people would think that's crazy. But when you change auto shop to cannabis, suddenly people somehow sometimes think that's right or normal, and that blows my mind. So anyway, probably a little bit of a non-tangent, but that's sort of, I think, where the cannabis stigma comes up.
And with, you know, I want to end on New York before we take some audience questions. You know, Deshita, you mentioned transitioning from medical to rec, and New York, as we know, is a very restrictive, like, monopolized medical program, 10 ROs, very, like, more pharma-oriented. And the adult use program is very much not about that. And then there's the issue of over-regulation, right? Like, I think a lot of people think about over-regulation and think like, oh, these are just designed to like help the big businesses. And you know, maybe they are, or maybe they just have the effect of like big businesses are the ones that are able to comply with like these stringent regulations. So, you know, if you have a message to the regulators here and even the lawmakers here, like what are some of the pitfalls that they can take from, you know, Oregon or California in terms of rolling out the adult use market in a way that is welcoming to smaller businesses, to social equity applicants, where the barriers of entry aren't so high? Like, is there anything about the MRTA that you think should be changed? Is there anything about like the proposed regulations that you think they need to be careful in terms of how they implement them?
It's your turn, I guess so. You know, it's always complicated to talk about New York because we're peeling a really interesting onion. So right now, New York is, to me, really innovating, trying to attack this idea of government accountability in the licensing process. And so I'm really excited about that, and they're creating an opportunity that is turnkey. Some would say that's really taking away all of the barriers in some ways. But I also challenge back, and you know, I'm constantly looking at, are we still over-regulating? And when I think about the medical market that exists, there were things that were taken away on the consumer side, but there are still things that we still have to kind of wait and see as to where it's going to land, that was steeped in a Cuomo administration. This is still a gateway drug type of regulatory policy. And so some of that's going to have to be undone. And I think when you are tasked, like the Office of Cannabis Management is, with building the ranks of 200 plus employees, and at the same time creating the initial framework for adult use to get started, it's hard to look back at what is deemed the lesser opportunity of medical and start to stir, you know, the pot there. And I think mostly what I see is them trying to fix things in adult use that didn't get fixed in medical. And you know, I say if it wasn't such a far contrast, right, MRTA versus where we were, I would probably push against that. Why? Because I do feel very strongly that medical and all of it deserves and should have equity, right? Slaves grew hemp, period, full stop. And at the end of the day, we enter those industries without thinking about it, and at some point we will have to do the work to double back. And because I'm now on the government side, I keep hearing that work is a fiscal. That means it's going to be not revenue neutral. At some point, the government's going to have to spend money to go back to fix the medical problem. So if it's closer in perspective and even mentality, in places where medical passed, I was in New Jersey, we better at least have flower. There's an opportunity for New Jersey to fix the terrors of the medical past there. I think New York is too far in contrast of just the ideology going into the legalization. So to me, it's about a cost-benefit analysis on the fix now versus later. They'll probably learn more if you fix it through the adult use, and then you can double back and implement it there. And that's me thinking about it from a strategic perspective and how I would approach it. But it's a Rubik's Cube, and it's a puzzle, and what makes it interesting is every state is different. I'll just end that I really have worked in almost really every legal market in some capacity, some not, and I really feel that we can learn so much by starting to identify things that just didn't work and not bringing it over. Stop thinking you're the first to do something, because odds are you're not, and there's a way for us to learn and optimize, and I think we should do that a little bit more, and we do that with the Cannabis Regulators and Color Coalition, CRCC. We're trying to aggregate and then provide that intel to other regulators, to legislators, and to the consumers, so you can know what to advocate for as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, coming from California, the failure of the game, just mainly because we were first, and it was too many cats to put in. It's not that we're bad guys out there, they just didn't listen. And one thing some hope that I see in New York is the fact that I'm sitting on the stage talking about it. They were very like, hey, let's go get some people that actually did it, that actually were actual soldiers, not, bureaucrats. Sit down in the room and talk to them and find out what not to do. So, that's why I've been in Albany for the last 5 or 6 months, talking with actual legislative people, regulators, and they will actually listen to me. And I can tell with some of the things that I've seen happen since those talks were happening, they're actually listening. And one of the biggest things that I would say, cannabis was already in New York before y'all passed this bill. Cannabis was definitely in California before they passed any bill with us. We're not regulators and guys, they're not special. You're actually just in charge of taking a market that already existed and putting it in a framework so that it works for everybody. You get your taxes, the legacy guy continues to do his thing and find a way to put some rules in there where the taxes can actually go back to the communities and all of these good old things like that. That's what's gonna happen, because if New York thinks for 1 second that they're just gonna, we figured out what they did in Cali and Oklahoma and all of that, and we've got it all under control, and the OCM doesn't listen to anybody, and they just do what they want to do. The legacy market here, like she said herself today, is the biggest market in the world. And if you do not include them, you will be taken over by them, and that's a fact.
I'll give a little bit of it's not a cop-out, it's true. I think some of what New York is doing is so far ahead of what other states are doing that it's kind of hard to be like, well, let's pick critiques, because it's just light years ahead. What I would say is making sure that the state realizes that having a social equity program, having social equity applicants isn't a give back, it's a necessity. It is a requirement, and the social equity applicants are one of the greatest assets that this industry will have, because they will bring long-standing knowledge, history, community forward, and so making sure that it's paired with grant programs, small business loan programs, training programs, making sure that enforcement, when it starts, is not enforcement, but that it is, hey, by the way, there's this reg, when we come back, we'd like to see it fixed, not let's come kick the door down and take stuff. There was some Colorado that started with the door kicking part, and it was a big problem. Other states have been better at that. I think New York would be even better. And then, if I were to pick one small thing, and it illustrates the point I made earlier, which is what are you trying to solve for, and I have to call it out, is there was some stuff around cannabis packaging and advertising that came out around cartoon shapes and using terms like weed and stoner. These are terms that have been part of the industry. And this is where I will say this, because it's always made me chuckle. There are a wide range of regulations across states with varying levels of strictness of packaging, labeling, iconography, using cartoon characters, ranging from no restriction at all to, I remember one state in their draft regs had edibles will not be in shapes in one of the draft regs. Are they supposed to be little blobs or whatever? That obviously came out and somebody read it. The funny thing is in
we look across all those states because it's intended to go after youth usage or preventing youth inducement. There's absolutely no difference in youth usage rates across any of those states. There's a very wide difference in the legal market capture rate and how effective legal markets are. In Washington, where they basically let stores have no signage, one of the biggest problems that's consistently plagued the industry is how do you induce people to come have a pleasurable shopping experience in a store that can't have clear windows, looks like a bunker, and where the maximum sign size is like 40 inches by 20 inches. And so you have to be careful with these regs and you constantly think, what are we solving for and has it worked in other states?
All right, we have a few minutes left. Are there any audience questions? I think...
You know what? You can come up and talk for you.
Question for you. Just listening to everyone, I couldn't help but to hear that there's a disconnect that you all kind of see in leadership style. So you have autocratic leadership, you have servant leadership, you have cat. So what it seems like is people don't care what you know till they know you care, right? So if you have legacy people and then you have regulators and lawmakers, they all have different leadership styles and different interests. So if you could create a narrative that is more than appearance, that actually bridges the gap, you could probably bring the education, like you had said, my sister said, that could bridge the gap, and you always say in different ways, that way maybe everyone can win. So one is worried about the triple bottom, the fiscal, the shareholders, you can bridge it when it's like the Medici effect. What would you say with your experience? How do we bring all these different specialists into a space of also timing? Like you said, now they're listening in Albany. We have an open time, especially after the pandemic. What do you think do you think it's timing, or what else do you think is needed to bring this like dialogue, bridging the gap?
Yeah, I mean, again, timing, man, and the fact that the legacy market, the fact that legacy people went to Albany, and it wasn't held at McDonald's, it was held in the building where the lawmakers was at. And they were actually listening, and the legacy market was brave enough to go there. To me, that told me a lot, because when it happened back over with us, we weren't going nowhere near City Hall. Okay, so the fact that guys are actually listening, and the fact that the legislators are actually listening, I think Tremaine said it earlier. You guys got to understand how this works. When they give you that 30 to 60 day period to come in and complain, you better take your asses down there and complain, because you can't complain when they put those rules and regs in there, because then it has to just play itself out till it's so bad that then you guys go back and make a big deal about it. But that's, how long is that going to take? So my advice is, when they have that 30 and 60 day window, if whatever comes out that you don't like, man, you guys better go out there and complain, because they don't want this to fail. Tremaine and her group and all of those guys, I was in LA, we had a whole group just like OCM, and they were put there, and unfortunately weren't given the tools to actually make it happen. They have the tools, but they don't want to fail either, because it's going to be egg on their face. I just let you guys know. Any more questions? All the way in the back?
Can I also just add to your question? I think starting with government accountability, nonpartisan government accountability, just establishing that, most states are choosing to even look at this because of the revenue potential. Everyone's coffers looks crazy post-COVID. And yeah, this is looking like that thing, but where's the government accountability for the transition from it being the tool for racially biased